All right. Well, we've hit 7:02, so I'll go ahead and get things started tonight. We have a lot of people signed up for this one, so I'll try and keep an eye on letting people in the room as we go. And I'll welcome you by saying, my name is Natalie Fritz, and I am the Archivist and Outreach Director for the Clark County Historical Society. And this is one of our monthly virtual programs that we've been doing since 2020. And we usually are sharing different things from our collections and archives having to do with local history, but sometimes we have special guests, and this is one of those nights. And I'm very excited to have with us Chris Woodyard, who's the author of the Haunted Ohio books that many of you may be familiar with. They're wonderful books. I know it's always a good gift that I get from my husband who loves the books. But Chris, I know that I don't know if you remember, but I met you several years ago when you were
Yes.
working on the woman in your first historic one of your haunted series.
Right. The face in the window. Yes.
And you came here to do some historic newspaper research, which is what all of those books are based in. So that's when I first learned that you were working on that series, and that you now have about five of the historic ghost series books, including your Victorian death one and your A is for arsenic. So you have, what is it, five of the Haunted Ohio
Yes.
series now.
Mm-hmm.
So those are wonderful stories that can make you scared to go anywhere in Ohio. So you had contacted us a while back to let us know that you would still have these books available, and if we wanted to sell them in our gift shop. And we had been looking to expand things that we offer in our gift shop, so we were happy to be able to add those, and they've been very, very popular.
Excellent.
The things that we have, and we thought you would make for a great guest speaker to be able to share some of the stories of some of your favorites, and maybe some of the local ones having to do with Springfield.
Absolutely.
Happy to have you here tonight, and I'll turn it over to you to share.
All right.
Thank
Thank you. Well, good evening. Unaccustomed as I am to public spooking, I'm just delighted to be here tonight to talk about some of my adventures in what I call Ohio, the haunt of it all, and share some ghostly and ghastly stories from Clark County. And thanks to Natalie Fritz and Donna Lewis for arranging and organizing this virtual visit. It's a treat. When I was a small child, I was terrified of ghosts. My childhood was a lot like the movie The Sixth Sense, because it runs in our family to see and sense dead people. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, who came from a particularly haunted part of Switzerland, and now my daughter all had or have this ability. Initially, I set out to exercise my personal fears at the request of the Beaver Creek reference librarians. As I was finishing a book called The Right Stuff, A Guide to Life in the Dayton Area, one of the librarians asked me, "What are you going to do next?" Well, they'd been so helpful and so enthusiastic that I said, what book do you need? And immediately they said, "We need a book of Ohio ghost stories." And she told me that the books that get stolen from the library most often are books on ghosts, books on sex, books on dogs, and books on bartending. I haven't come up with a book that covers all of those topics, but that was the inspiration for the Haunted Ohio series. I jokingly call myself a Ghostbuster sometimes, but I don't really bust ghosts. I don't have a laser pack. I don't drive a hearse. The only time I've been slimed was by my baby daughter with some cream spinach. And what I do is really kind of boring. I just go into a site, and my rule is that nobody's allowed to tell me anything about it before I go in. And I walk around alone, taking notes on what I see or feel. I sit down with the property owner and discuss what I experienced after that. I don't use any electronic devices. I don't use a Ouija board. I don't shout at ghosts like they do on TV. And I don't hold seances. People sometimes ask me if I'm a medium, and I say, no, I'm a short. So how did I unearth these many ghost stories? I started by writing letters to every library and historical society in the state, and they were wonderful. They sent me to local experts, told me about local history books. It took me 10 years to collect stories from all 88 counties. There were a lot of dead zones where it was hard to find stories. I visited historic sites, I visited private homes, and interviewed people about their ghostly experiences. And making house calls was always an adventure. I never knew if I would see something or just sense what I call atmosphere. Atmosphere is kind of like having something invisible fly up in your face unexpectedly or being punched in the stomach. It can also feel like electricity. I was called to a house in Beaver Creek where the woman told me before I could stop her that she had seen the ghost of the former owner in the kitchen. So I was walking around the kitchen and I didn't feel a thing. And I thought, I'm going to have to tell this nice lady that there's nothing here. Well, she ushered me into a little dining alcove off the kitchen so I could sit down and take some notes. And I walked right into this thing. It was like walking into a live current of electricity, and it was going over my head, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. And I said to her, I don't know what it is, but I just walked right into it. And she screamed and she said, that's where I saw him. I was a little short with her. I said, you told me you saw him in the kitchen. No, he walked from the kitchen right through where you're standing and through that wall. So I found someplace else to sit. That's atmosphere. It can infest, if you will, a single room or a whole house. I lived in one of those infested homes. Actually, it was the apartment above my haunted vintage clothing store in Columbus at Chittenden and High. I'm trying to get the slide. There we go. It was just across the street from the OSU Law School. It was two halves of a double knocked together, and I lived alone. I had the only key, and night after night, I would wake up and hear footsteps pacing in the hall and up and down the stairs. In the other side of the double, there was a room where we stored all the sewing equipment, and I hated this room during the day, and nothing would get me in there after dark. Once, though, as an experiment, I sent a friend up there without mentioning anything about it. I was just curious to see if she would notice anything wrong. I didn't know it, but she was also sensitive to ghosts, and she saw what she described as an evil-looking man standing in the empty closet and came close to having a panic attack. I'm not sure she's forgiven me yet. One of my clerks kept getting pushed down the back stairs by what we began to call the old man. And at first I scoffed. I said, oh, you just caught your heel in your skirt. No, she insisted. I felt a hand on my back giving me a shove. So I did a little checking, and it turned out the apartment has once been an optician's office. And like me, the doctor had lived upstairs, and he had died in that back room. Now, the stories I collect for my books fell into several categories. There were experiences that I had personally, like the vintage clothing store, or where I was able to interview somebody about what they'd experienced, and also historical stories or legends. I generally avoided urban legends, although I did retell a couple of folk tales in Spooky Ohio, 13 Traditional Tales, and in some of the Haunted Ohio books. The classic urban legend is Crybaby Bridge, where a mother and child jump or are thrown from a bridge and their bodies are never found. People driving across the bridge have their car stall, and if they go to the bridge at midnight, they'll hear the baby cry. It seems as though there are crybaby bridges in every county of every state, and they're a bit of a paranormal cliche. I hear from James Willis, who's been collecting these stories in the Ghosts of Ohio Crybaby Bridge Project, that there's one on Garlow Road in Pitchen, and there was one at Cable, and he says that it's now been destroyed. There was possibly one off Lower Valley Pike, although I'm not sure what bridge over what creek, because you've got Minnick Ditch and Donalds Creek and Jackson Creek. But there seem to be several different types of ghosts, spectral species, if you will. The classic type is the ghost who wants to tell someone where their treasure's buried. I never get any of those. It's unfortunate. But one type of ghost is the ghost with a purpose. Maybe they have some unfinished business or something they really want to get done. One lady told me that the ghost of her husband returned simply to remind her to buy a particular brand of storm windows that they'd discussed before he died. In 1909, a telegram messenger boy told how late at night he tried to deliver a telegram at a house on the edge of Springfield. He got no response from knocking at the front door. He went around to the back door, and as he did so, up came the cellar door with a crash. It was dark, but he could see a ghostly white object. It walked up to him and said, "Come help me. I cannot sleep on this hard ground." It then opened the cellar door again and went down the steps. He was terrified. He ran all the way back to the telegram office, and there he was laughed at. But the next day, one of the employees decided to take the boy and see who was playing a prank. They opened the cellar door, and at the bottom of the cellar steps, they found the body of a man, later found to be a murder victim. He wanted his body found and properly buried. Then there's the weirdly practical reason this ghost had for returning. The narrator told how her grandfather, who lived on Fisher Street, died of the cholera in 1849 and was buried in Greenmount Cemetery. After the funeral, it rained heavily. The narrator's grandmother heard a noise in the bedroom, and when she asked who was there, her late husband's voice said, "It's me, Mother." She was startled, of course, but she said, "What does this mean?" And the voice answered, "I am changing my clothes. My grave is so full of water that I can't rest." She could plainly see her dead husband changing his clothes, and when he was finished, he vanished. The next day, she went to the cemetery and found that the grave had sunk and there was a pool of water standing over the grave. She had the sexton make a mound of dirt over the grave, and after it was fixed, she never had another visit. Sometimes we don't know why a ghost visits. There were 2 inexplicable sightings of a ghostly woman in white at St. Bernard's Church. In 1909, a man named Joseph Herzog, the church's sexton, was working. As he climbed to the belfry to ring the bell for Mass, a woman dressed in white, carrying a white book under her arm, appeared on the steps in front of him. His first thought, she was a new organist. But then he realized there was just something strange about her. She just appeared out of nowhere. He followed her. He saw her turn and enter the organ loft, and he rushed into the loft after her, and there was no one there. How she had so completely disappeared mystified him. But some 8 or 10 years before that, a former sexton also claimed to have seen a ghost in the form of a woman in white in the belfry, and his description almost matched exactly that of Herzog's. 2 Urbana police officers had a weird experience one night after they noticed a car parked by the high school as they drove by about 3 a.m. The car looked empty, but they pulled up and ran a stolen vehicle check. One of them, Brian, thought he could see a face in the car's rearview mirror. He said could see a teenage girl with long, straight blonde hair ducking down in the seat, trying to hide, and he knew she was looking at him because the 2 made direct eye contact. He told his partner, Dave, there was a girl in the car and he'd tell her to move along, but when he shone his flashlight in the car, it was empty. He was completely confused. He walked completely around the car. It was empty. But then he could see her in the mirror looking at him. His partner was equally confused. He could see the girl, and he didn't understand why Brian wasn't talking to her. So Dave got out of the cruiser and said, "What are you doing?" Brian said, "Stand where you are. Describe what you see in the passenger side mirror." Dave said he saw a girl. She's thin, long blonde hair, just a kid. See her too, Brian, but man, there is nobody in that car. The car wasn't stolen. There were no warrants out for the owner, so they just left. And the next day, the car was gone. Traditional ghost lore says that ghosts are often visible in mirrors. Was the blonde girl a murdered runaway, an accident victim, or maybe a phantom hitchhiker just along for the ride? Another type of ghost, although some people don't think it's a ghost, is a poltergeist. Some poltergeists knock, others throw and break objects or make them vanish. Still others set fires. The typical fiery poltergeist case almost always starts with a neglected or abused child who finds themselves as the center of mysterious fires breaking out throughout the household. Some researchers think that these people who are the focus of poltergeist activity may be setting fires or throwing things in a trance or a dissociative state, so they don't remember doing those things. And there's a lot of controversy over whether these troubled kids are actually moving things or setting fires with their minds, or if it's just clever fakery. But there are centuries of reports about people who apparently have a mysterious talent for spontaneously starting fires. One local poltergeist mystery has stuck with me. I wrote a chapter about it in The Face in the Window. It's the story of Minnie Markle, accused of setting fires at the boarding house where she was a servant. Minnie was an orphan, She was sickly and suffered from seizures and other diseases, and that's often the marker for poltergeist activity. Minnie worked at the widowed Jane McGowan's house at 279 West Southern Avenue. I believe the house is gone now. In mid-December 1890, mysterious fires, sometimes 25 in a day, suddenly began to break out in the boarding house, destroying clothing and papers and bedclothes. And Minnie almost always seemed to be on the spot when a fire erupted, sometimes raising the alarm. Poltergeist targets are often symbolic, and in this case, it was all the clothing and soft furnishings of the boarding house. One day, Minnie was ironing with a basket of dampened laundry at her feet. Flames burst from the wet linen. Her apron strings caught on fire, and the apron, the badge of her domestic service, fell to the ground, an obvious symbol of her wish to be free. Minnie denied any involvement in the mysterious fires, although if she was setting fires while in one of her seizures or a trance-like state, her conscience would have been clear. And she remarked pathetically to a reporter that Mrs. McGowan's house was the only home she had, and when it was gone, she would be cast upon the world to care for herself. Mrs. McGowan, who ran the boarding house and had always been kind to Minnie, was devastated. Most of what she'd owned had been burned. And after paying for a fraction of the damage, her insurance company canceled her policy, insult to injury. Mrs. McGowan had to move in with her daughter. Some of the neighbors whispered that Minnie was bewitched and had the ability of communicating combustion. They were almost ready to start a Salem crusade against her, as one paper said, and then Mrs. McGowan's daughter consulted a spiritualist medium and publicly accused Minnie of setting the fires. A few days after Christmas, 1890, one of the local newspapers printed the accusations against her. A rival paper noted that these were denied by Mrs. McGowan, and in fact, the entire neighborhood is up in arms at the cruel and utterly unfounded charges. The rival paper also noted that a Detective Wilson visited the house and thoroughly investigated the matter, and he said there's no grounds for the charges. But the poor young lady was thrown into spasms last evening, said the paper on reading the account, and bitterly, tearfully denied the alleged report today. Some of the boarders think that someone has used chemicals to start the fires. This was a really smart suggestion because several of the boarders mentioned in articles about the fires worked at the Innisfallen greenhouse, a world-famous center known for its roses. The owner, C.A. Reeser, had made a special study of soil preparation and fertilizers. And some of the fiery incidents, such as when a police officer who'd been alone in a room for 30 minutes watched the curtains burst into flames, suggested that someone was cleverly using combustible chemicals. It was fascinating to find an article written nearly 20 years after these fires by a man named Jack Reed, a journalist who'd covered the original story. And he said nobody at the time truly suspected her because they thought the fires must have been set by someone with the knowledge of chemistry. He and another reporter found phosphorus on the carpet of one of the rooms in the boarding house. They reported this find in the papers, and suddenly the fires stopped. Reed didn't name a specific suspect, but he did call the perpetrator he. No arrests were ever made. I expected that Minnie's case would follow the usual course of poltergeist stories. She would be arrested and browbeaten into a confession, or she would be caught in the act of starting a fire. So it was kind of shocking to find that after being accused in the papers, Minnie fell into a coma and died on the 2nd of February, 1891. She's buried at Ferncliff Cemetery. It was said that she died of a broken heart after being falsely accused. Another ghostly category is the person who doesn't know that they're dead. Dorothy Amling told a story in 1991 about a ghostly woman in white on Madison County's Van Wagoner Road. Her older brother was driving home near Madden's Higgins Road on a foggy autumn night in the mid-1950s, and suddenly a woman in white appeared in the road in front of him, waving her arms and crying, "I need help, help, please help me." "What do you need?" he asked. Help me, I need help," the woman kept repeating. He kept asking, "What's wrong?" and she never replied. And then he realized that the woman was transparent and floating rather than walking. He was terrified and raced off home. A few days later, Dorothy's father heard from a sheriff's deputy that a woman who lived in a house near where Dorothy's brother had stopped had disappeared. Her husband swore he knew nothing about her disappearance. They eventually found her body wearing a white nightgown in a well beside the house. The coroner said she'd been dead 6 or 7 days. Whether she drowned by accident or foul play, they never determined. No one was ever charged with the crime, but the young man was convinced that he had encountered the drowned woman's spirit just seconds after it left the body at the bottom of the well. One of the most dramatic ghostly encounters I had with a ghost who didn't know he was dead came at a house near Tremont City. As I pulled up, a couple of cats and a little black dog with fluffy muffy ears came out to greet me. I later was told by the family that while the cats were real, the little black dog was also a ghost that they see around the house all the time. I had a chat with the owner and her daughter, and then I started my walkthrough. I got to the bottom of the stairs and looked up, and there was something at the top of the stairs crouched, leering at me. I walked through the entire upstairs, and then I reluctantly turned to the attic where whatever this was had retreated. I opened the little door, and something popped out and smacked me on my chin, snapping my head back. I slammed the door and put my back against it and just sort of panted for several minutes. It's one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. It actually left a mark on my chin. I was relieved to find that the family had also experienced problems in the attic. The ghost seemed to be a man. I sensed he'd been a farmhand who slept in the attic. He was very religious, and he was furiously angry because he seemed to say, if I'm dead, why am I not in heaven? The owner and her daughter said they avoided the attic whenever possible. And the owner's husband, when we chatted on the phone later, said if he went into the attic, he got irrationally enraged. I suggested they try to talk to the ghost and explain he needed to move on. And I think things calmed down a bit after that, but the ghost was not happy with me invading his personal attic. Still another category of paranormal experience is the time warp. I tend to see houses the way they used to look and to walk into walls that aren't there anymore, which is really, really embarrassing. At a house near Urbana, where a woman doctor had lived and practiced medicine, I saw the house as it formerly was configured. It didn't have a porch on it anymore, as it does today, when I first drove up. Then I saw smoke in the parlor, where years ago the parlor stove had overheated and burned off the front of the house. I saw a corpse lying in the owner's mother's bed. The owner was naturally very, very upset to hear this, and I had to reassure her I was seeing a long ago dead person in the room that had been the doctor's clinic. I also saw the lady doctor, a woman in white, on the stairs, the same apparition seen by the house owner. And unnervingly, as I stood in an upstairs window looking out, something stroked my hair. Since it's gotten easier to access historic newspapers and books online, I've had a lot of fun collecting historic ghost stories, some of which ended up in The Face in the Window, The Headless Horror, and The Ghost Wore Black. I'm particularly fascinated by these ghosts known as the Women in Black. These were apparitions dressed in mourning clothes and veil of the Victorian widow. They prowled around in the dark. They would leap and sometimes attack people unfortunate enough to encounter them. And when cornered, the creatures simply melted away into darkness. There was often ambiguity as to whether the woman in black was some flesh and blood human in mourning clothing or a supernatural omen of death. You can see from the photo how creepy they must have looked flitting around in the dark. In 1886, a police officer named McAuliffe described seeing a woman in black on Linden Avenue. He said, I don't believe in ghosts, nothing of the kind, but this was really a mysterious affair. About 2 o'clock this morning, as I was coming up Linden Avenue, I saw a remarkably tall female figure, clothed all in black, coming down the hill from Clifton Street. I thought nothing of it, and thinking I would have plenty of time to see what she was when I met her. The officer looked away momentarily, then heard the click of a gate closing at his side. He looked up, but could see nothing in the yard of the house. He said he heard no other sound than the closing of the gate, no door opening, no footsteps. The woman in black had simply vanished. And in 1910, a man named George Alexander, who lived near Ohio Avenue, said that a woman in black would emerge from his barn at night and head down the road towards the open countryside. It caused a panic in the neighborhood. Some people actually were said to have moved away to avoid the ghost. Alexander finally got up the courage to chase her, but even though he said he rode his horse nearly to death, the apparition always just kept in front of him and finally disappeared. Haunted objects are a very fascinating category to me. I love antiques, and sometimes I find a piece with something attached to it, and I won't have it in the house. Judy and Jim from St. Paris bought an old immigrant trunk, much like the one in the photo, from an antique dealer. It dated from about 1720 to 1740. It was painted with faded red buttermilk paint and was big enough to hold a man. They moved to an 1854 house in Champaign County and put the trunk in their family room. But Judy kept feeling a menacing intruder presence in the house, and Judy's elderly mother complained of footsteps in the night. Jim's sister also heard the footsteps up and down the stairs and saw a very dark bearded man, very tall, dark bearded man in old-fashioned clothes. The young daughter, Beth, saw him too, and to the children, he seemed really solid, very real, and very mean. When Beth saw him striding down the hall towards her, she ran to the bathroom, crawled behind the toilet, and screamed. So what did you do? Judy called in the neighborhood psychic. The woman brought in a silver needle suspended from a tripod, and it didn't react to anything in the house until she put it on the trunk. The woman asked questions, and the needle would move one way for yes, another direction for no. And according to this, there were two people associated with the trunk, a man and a girl. The girl had brought the trunk from Scotland when she eloped with her lover. Her father followed the couple, killed his daughter, and then himself. His violent spirit couldn't rest. Judy asked the antique dealers if they knew of any history of the trunk. They did. The ancestor of the original owners had brought the trunk from Scotland, they said, and according to family legend, she had been murdered. I mentioned the little black dog ghost at the house where the ghostly man hit me. Springfield has a very unusual animal ghost haunting Myers Hall at Wittenberg. The hall was built in 1847 as the original university building. It also served as a hospital once during the Civil War and again during World War I during the influenza pandemic. It's said that some of the patients who died there still haunt Myers Hall, but it's a phantom horse that is most often reported. The story goes that a dying Civil War officer asked to see his horse one last time. After leading the horse up 5 flights of stairs to the man's bedside, the officer's friends couldn't get him to walk back down the stairs, so appallingly, they shot him. And now the ghostly horse can be heard galloping around on the 5th floor. My cousin went to Wittenberg, and she swore she heard the hoofbeats and felt the swoop of the horse as it rushed by. I wrote my last Haunted Ohio book in 2003 for Ohio's bicentennial. After that, thanks to the life-changing miracle of online historical databases, I kept running across odd stories about Victorian death and mourning, gruesome stories of body snatching and burial alive, and heartless jokes about widows and cholera. These inspired my books, The Victorian Book of the Dead and A is for Arsenic, and ABC of Victorian Death, on the basics and the popular culture of Victorian death and mourning. In the Victorian era, people believed in death omens, what were called death tokens. And a young woman described how in 1910, she was at an Ohio Electric Railway station in Summerford when she smelled rags burning. Other people at the station smelled it too. When she got to her Springfield home and was sitting at the supper table, she heard screaming and smelled the same thing burning that she had at the station. When she rushed to the other side of the house, her mother's clothes were enveloped in flames. and her mother died of her burns a few hours later. The young woman firmly believed that the smell had been a token of her mother's death. The family of a Springfield man believed that a mysteriously striking clock was a token of death. Alfonso Farrell died in 1905. In his bedroom was an old clock he'd bought when he got married years before. It didn't run, hadn't been wound for years. But for 3 nights before he died, and on the night that he died, the clock struck once at midnight. His family investigated, but they found that the key was lost. No one could have wound up the clock, and they took it as a death omen. In writing the Victorian Book of the Dead, I ran across many stories of strange deaths, like the girl who died of lizards and the young woman murdered by her pet parrot. Although perhaps not as strange as those, here are a few local strange deaths. In 1907, Mrs. Daniel Clower's husband, an engineer at the Oddfellows home, died suddenly, found wedged between the wall and the boilers in the basement with a fractured skull. Nobody ever figured out what had killed him. His was the 6th death in the family in 18 months. And shortly after her husband's death, Mrs. Clower, who was apparently in good health, told her daughter that she had seen a vision of her little niece, dead since the previous October, surrounded by angels, beckoning to her with a baby hand. She's been calling and beckoning me for a month, she said to her daughter, and now that Daniel is gone, there's no reason why I should not go to be with them. Mrs. Clower was found dead in her bed a little over a month after the death of her husband, and the headlines read, "Dies at behest of baby ghost." 2 unusual child deaths were that of a little boy from South Charleston who was crushed to death by a tombstone while playing in a graveyard in 1871, and a 5-year-old girl died in 1905 after eating Easter eggs colored with poisonous dyes. And finally, it was reported in 1870 that a Miss Susan Rickett, age 18, had died by tight lacing, which is lacing her corset too tight. I could only find a Susan Rickett buried in Ferncliff who died in 1883, so this may have just been anti-corset propaganda. Doctors disapproved of tight corsets. On the other hand, there was a joke going around in 1871. A girl in Springfield, Ohio, who danced with her corsets pulled up to the last hole, meaning tightly laced, was soon after in a hearse that pulled up to the last hole dug in the graveyard. That's a real thigh slapper. While Springfield has been known as the Rose City for its greenhouse business and as the Champion City after the Champion Reaper, the town could have been called Casket City after the Springfield Metallic Casket Company, one of the nation's largest manufacturers of metal caskets and burial vaults. The illustration shows a bliss press that was used to shape some of the parts for the metal caskets. What with the Casket Company and the Champion Chemical Company, manufacturer of embalming fluids and supplies, Springfield was a mecca for mortuary goods. So it's appropriate that Clark and Champaign counties also have a history of strange burials. During the 19th century, medical schools needed subject for dissection to train doctors. Nobody deliberately donated their body to science like they do these days. If you wanted to be a 19th century doctor, you couldn't just stroll into the anatomy lab and find your own specimen laid out on the table. You had to go dig up your own. Resurrectionists, as they were called with ghoulish humor, would wait until someone was buried and then hurriedly dig down to the head of the coffin, break it open, and plunge a hook into the corpse under its chin or place a noose around its neck. And the corpse was then winched or hauled out of the grave. The grave was refilled, and most importantly, the corpse's vital internal organs were not injured, which was important to the medical school. People were terrified of having their bodies stolen and ending up on the dissection table. And this terrible fear led one Springfield family to do their own grave robbing. In 1891, a wealthy farmer from German Township named Eli Davis died of a mysterious illness. He called in multiple doctors. They didn't know what was wrong with him. A corpse with an unusual disease was a tempting prize for a doctor, and the family knew they had to be careful. So the news article said, immediately after the funeral and dispersion of friends, they exhumed the remains and carried them to their residence, where they were kept until yesterday. The horrible stench from the remains aroused the curiosity of neighbors. They refused for a time to reinter the remains, but arguments for the health of the family finally led to the reinterment, this time in a burglar-proof vault. The public's fears about body snatching was the inspiration for the Champion Chemicals Company's burglar-proof grave vaults. It was noted in 1896 that the burglar-proof grave vault is welcomed as a long-sought precaution by the thousands who have a horror of the body snatcher. And the article describes a formidable contrivance with angle iron and steel plates and rivets, and everything's arranged so cleverly that it would take 24 hours to cut the entire top off, and that's the only way you could get it open. And the ad said that thousands are in use. I wish I really knew how many of these formidable contrivances were actually put underground. Metallic coffins also figure in the story of Mrs. George Tyree, who in 1891 died and then came back to life. The undertaker had already been called. She woke out of a death-like trance, sat up in bed, and said, "I have come back to be baptized." So the Reverend W.A. Cross from Springfield was summoned, but he wouldn't take her to the church. He said it would kill her. So instead, he filled with water the metallic coffin that had been brought by the undertaker, and with her husband's help, immersed her. She rallied a bit after the plunge, but she died a few days later, having predicted the exact moment of her death. Metallic caskets also feature in the curious burial request of Mr. Stephen Bell. He was a former public official of Springfield, and he was one of the founders of Bellbrook, Ohio. He was both rich and eccentric, and he supposedly asked before his death in 1850 that he be put into a cast iron coffin in a vault at Greenmount Cemetery, a Fisk cast iron burial case like that in the right-hand photo. And that coffin should remain there for 100 years before being buried. 2 years later, in 1852, a young relative, we're not quite sure who she was, passed away and was also buried in Bell's vault. And the mausoleum with its two mummy-like coffins became a macabre tourist attraction. Curiosity seekers came to visit and look at the well-preserved, some said petrified, remains through the glass viewing windows in the tops of the coffins. The young girl's face was well preserved, and they said that masses of golden hair were visible through the glass portal. In 1919, it was reported that the glass viewing window in Bell's casket had been broken, and orders were given to board up the vault doors so visitors could no longer gawk at them. In 1927, Bell's granddaughter, seeing the mausoleum's decaying state, moved him to the Bellbrook Cemetery. Moving beyond the supernatural and the funereal, Clark County and its surrounding counties have yielded some fascinating mysteries. In 1951, the phantom of Route 40 caused a panic among drivers along the Ohio portion of Route 40. This was a skeleton driving a car, a phantom car that glowed with green light that tried to drive truckers off the road at night. It was first seen near the Englewood Dam, but quickly moved east. Occasionally, truckers reported that the phantom got out of the car wearing a skull mask and a skeleton suit with the bones outlined in luminous paint. In 1952, the phantom wrote a letter to Clark County Sheriff J. Arthur Schumann. This was published under the headline, "Ghost Motorist Offers to Play Chase Me with Clark County Sheriff." The phantom claimed his car could travel 135 miles an hour. He said he had radar and sonar and a screen that would spot a patrol car 3 miles away. The phantom said he was willing to have a midnight meeting with the sheriff, but "Don't form a roadblock," the letter read. "The game must be a chase, not a block." Sheriff Schumann apparently didn't take the bait. And despite other sightings on Route 40 and other roads, the phantom was never caught. I love funereal ghost stories and haunted cemeteries, although, to be honest, ghosts are more likely to haunt where they lived rather than where they're buried. It's kind of a question whether the glowing tombstone at Evergreen Cemetery in St. Paris should be classed as a ghost or a mystery. The ghost, the stone marks the grave of Abraham Lincoln McMorran. He died in 1881, and it was said to glow so brightly it could be seen from the road. An article in the Piqua Daily Call described it and said there are no lights in the cemetery, and only the stone looks lit up as if by a spotlight. Strangely, when you walk up to the tombstone, no light is actually visible. Hundreds of people invaded the cemetery looking for the glowing tombstone, and the wife of a former sexton wrote an irritated letter to the Piqua Daily Call saying he saw that there was just a light reflected on it, and this is all nonsense, and you ought to stay away. So if you're thinking of going in search of the stone, let me put in my 2 cents worth. You probably don't need to be told that it's a bad idea to trespass in any cemetery after dark. Remember that poor little boy who got crushed by a tombstone in the South Charleston graveyard. One of the weirder historical stories I ran across had to do with a mysterious apparition during a wake. This happened around 1892 in a house between Mechanicsburg and Catawba on the Springfield Pike, where a family named Prentice lived. A little Prentice child had died, and the family and friends were sitting up with the remains, holding a wake. About midnight, when most of the occupants were dozing, a hand of fire suddenly appeared on one wall. It put out a finger and traced multiple lines along the wallpaper, which looked as though seared with a red-hot iron. Everybody fled in terror, but returning the next day, they could see that most of the wallpaper had lines burned into it. The mystery was never solved. Then there are the completely bizarre stories, like this one from Sheila, who lived in a haunted house in Champaign County, built about 1830. One night, she went downstairs in the middle of the night for a drink of water, and just as she walked into the living room, she said, a skeleton walked into the room from the kitchen. It looked like a person in a skeleton Halloween costume. The creature's mouth opened and made an O of surprise, and then it threw up its hands, startled. It jumped. I jumped. We both turned and ran, she said. She ran to her room where she said she felt strangely safe, as she felt like she'd scared it as badly as it had scared her. Sheila's family moved out, but they heard that when the new buyers opened up the sealed fireplace in Sheila's room, they found strands of long red hair, pieces of cloth, and old human bones. No one knows who was burned or bricked up in that fireplace. I don't try to convince anybody of the reality of ghosts. These stories can be enjoyed just as oddball glimpses of Ohio's history, as real ghost stories, or just as something to give you the shivers. But no matter what you believe about the reality of ghosts, I hope that someday you'll decide to visit that altered state of consciousness I call Ohio. I'll close tonight with what is said to be the world's shortest ghost story. A man was sitting on a bus. The woman next to him said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" "Ghosts," he snorted. "Of course not. Do you?" "Oh, yes," said the woman, and disappeared. Thank you, and sleep well tonight.
Well, thank you, Chris. So we can take questions in the chat if anyone has them, or if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, you're welcome to do that as well. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Of all of the books that you've done, do you have a favorite story or own personal encounter?
Oh, I'll tell you another time warp story, but it's not from Springfield. I mean, I'm partial to the one where I got smacked because that's so unusual. That just it's mostly unparalleled. You know, I don't usually have physical contact with these things. Um, but this was from Dayton. I was asked to come to a house and I drove up and I thought, wow, hit the jackpot. It looks like the Addams Family house because it was a ugly old farmhouse and there was a barn out back with vines all over it. And then I looked at the address and it was the new house next door I was visiting. So I did my walkthrough there, and that was a good walkthrough. And then I came out and I said, haha, I mistook this house for the haunted house. And that must have been the original farmhouse in the plat because it's got the barn and everything. And she looked at me kind of funny and she says, well, yeah, we had the barn torn down because it was getting too dangerous for the kids. And I walked around to where I could see the barn and it wasn't there anymore. I thought, what, you tore it down a half hour ago? I don't know how to explain that kind of thing. It's really quite odd. I was up at a place called River Styx in northeastern Ohio, and there's a trestle there, a railroad trestle that's one of the highest in the state. There's a history of suicides and train wrecks and things, and it's supposed to be haunted. I drove out there in the twilight to see it, and it wasn't there. And I drove back. I said, okay, I must have the wrong place. And I looked at my map. And the next morning I went out on the same road, same place. It's back. So is it a time warp? What am I seeing? It's quite odd.
That would be really freaky to have that.
Or running into a wall that isn't there. In
Yeah,
Lebanon,
and the fact that you can see that in houses, do you get like a sensation that you realize that you're seeing something that's not really there anymore, or is it
yeah.
just until you mention it?
Well, it's usually I see something and then, for example, near Tip City, I was driving up to the house and it just looked horrible. It just looked in a terrible state of decay. And then it had a very long driveway, and I got up to the house and it's like, oh, it's freshly painted. It's got little, chipmunks in the front yard and garden gnomes and things. And it was beautiful. It was nothing like what I saw from the road. And I mentioned this to the people and they said, oh, you should have seen this place before we fixed it up. It was a dump. So I don't know, honestly. I wish I did.
Well, there's a few questions in the chat, but I did
Sure.
want to say, this is with all of our virtual programs, these are recorded and they're put on our the Clark County Historical Society at the Heritage Center's YouTube channel later, and then they're also on our Facebook page. So I know we had a lot of people signed up for this one. I don't think everybody made it tonight. So I will definitely be sending an email link to anybody that signed up but that didn't make it to this one, and then we'll be sharing that later. So these will be available. Some of the questions we have in here is the most active place that you may have visited.
Oh gosh, probably the Mansfield Reformatory. Lots of people go there and have experiences. It's a very busy place. It's just like being watched constantly. And I had a very young inmate. I could see it was in the warden's quarters. He was wearing the usual uniform. And he started whining at me. He's like, take me out of here, get me out of here. And I said, you're dead. You can go anytime you want. He didn't hear me. He just kept whining. And I have very little patience for whiners. So, I just went to a different part of the prison. But then as I was leaving, he followed me out and he jumped on my back, like you try to stop somebody from leaving. And I'm shrugging my shoulders, going, get off me, get off me. And I'm praying that nobody's watching this. And as it turned out, one of the ladies who had invited me was, and she says, I thought you had a yellow jacket down your shirt or something. But he finally let me go because I wouldn't have let him get in my car. These things aren't allowed to follow me home. So it's a very, very active place. And it's a very interesting historical place as well.
I say it's a great museum and they've done a lot like to restore a lot of it.
Yes.
But we went for the second time last summer after about 10 years of being there. And it was the first time I ever felt anything
Wow.
anywhere really. And I know my daughter was with me, and I think she is sensitive to stuff sometimes. And she's gone to a couple of ghost hunting camp things. And she definitely felt ill there and felt a lot of things. And, so that place is a very definitely an active one. There's something in the questions about a local place that I know a lot of us have heard stories about. Do you know anything about the Hertzler house? Have you ever
I
experienced
have
anything?
visited it, and I knew nothing about it. I was just at the fair at New Boston, and I was walking through it, and I didn't feel anything in terms of Daniel Hertzler's death. He was murdered there, and what I felt was another time warp up in what was then the sort of, I think it was the spinning or the dyeing or the sewing room. It was sort of a little annex off of one of the rooms upstairs. And it was like I was walking into the past. It wasn't looking like it was. And then it switched back to our time. So that was the only thing I experienced there. But I was, kind of surprised I didn't sense the murdered man. But sometimes I don't.
There's a question. What do you think happens to ghosts when a building gets torn down?
Ooh, good question. Sometimes they move on. Sometimes they stay with the ground. And you build something new and they're still sticking around. Um, it doesn't happen that often. Usually they do move on. I hear a lot of stories about renovations. When somebody's renovating, it really stirs up the ghosts. So, but I think generally they just, it can go either way. But sometimes they're tied to the ground, or they think it's still their house, even though something's been rebuilt on the site.
There's a question about someone who's working on a book about paranormal activity in their hometown of Westerville, Ohio, and
Oh,
asking for any advice you might have on how to present the stories.
don't give out personal addresses. That's number one. If people want anonymity, give them a fake name and just put an asterisk on it and tell people, that that's a fake name, because not everybody wants people. There was an absolutely horrific tragedy in Worthington, Ohio, where everybody knew this was the local haunted house, and it was lived in by a woman and her son, and people would come to the house and badger, just roam around the yard without permission. And the young man got really sick of it, and a young woman was there with some of her friends, and she started walking up the driveway and he shot her. She didn't die, but she's had life-threatening injuries. And you don't want people coming to personal houses. And I've always tried to be careful about giving out locations unless it's a public venue. So those are kind of, in terms of presenting them, don't make anything up, don't enhance it. Just, try to give the people's words exactly as you can.
There's a question about if there's any movie that gets paranormal activity right, in your opinion.
Oh gosh, I don't watch horror movies because I have a very weak stomach, which is silly considering how much gory Victorian death stories I read. Um, my favorite movie is The Haunting of Hill House, with Julie Harris, not the Netflix series with Catherine Zeta-Jones, but this was a black and white movie, and everything's very subtle, and I just find it completely terrifying. I think it's a pretty accurate about things I've personally experienced.
And there's a question about how old were you when you first realized you could experience this ghost?
Oh, 3 or 4. I was at my great grandmother's house, and there was a little girl by the fireplace crying, and she was wearing old-fashioned clothes. I interpreted them as pilgrim clothes, which is nonsense because it's not that old a town. And I would turn the light on and she'd go away. And my great grandmother would come in and turn the light out, and she'd come back. We did this all night. I'm sure she was not happy with me. But it just terrified me. because I didn't know what I was seeing. And we weren't told anything about ghosts when I was a kid. I just had a vivid imagination. I was lying, I was making up stories, but because my parents didn't believe in it and they didn't want it talked about. Whereas my cousins who lived in the same town with my grandfather heard all the stories. And it wasn't until I was in college, my cousin had just died, and I was at a family reunion sitting next to my grandfather, and he said something about his dead brother and my cousin coming into his room at night. And my mouth fell open. I said, "You see them too?" And then he's telling me all this family lore, which I had never heard before. So yeah, it was kind of scary to not know what was going on.
Is it something, I know that you said with your books, you interviewed a lot of people to ask their stories and went to the places where they had the encounters. Is it something that just comes to you without you seeking it out or, going to those places? Is it a frequent occurrence for you?
I not at the grocery store, it doesn't just pop up. Um, Occasionally I'll see something maybe when I'm driving and think, what the heck was that? But in general, I have to be more focused about it. It's more, maybe I'm just blocking it out in daily life, because I don't want to be overwhelmed. It is easier when I go to a place and them just sort of concentrating on, what's here. So I would say that's probably the best answer I can give.
Are there any books that you're working on now?
I am. It's not very exciting for ghost lovers, because it's a book on mourning textiles. So it's a historical book. I've also been contributing chapters to, I've got a chapter in a book, a forthcoming book from Exeter Press in the UK, about changelings in North America. So that'll be coming out next year. I just wrote a chapter on fairy fashions for a book on the Cottingley fairy case. So yeah, I'm doing that. I would love to do another like Ghost War Black, only with European ghosts, because I've got a lot of good stories. And I may do another book on US ghosts in the 19th century, because there's just so much rich material. Everybody was making fun of people for being superstitious, and yet people had so many interesting stories to tell, and they still believed in ghosts. Even if somebody said, "Oh, that's ignorant, you shouldn't believe in these things," they were still having experiences.
There's a question about encounters you've had with animal ghosts. What do you think causes them to stick around?
Well, they love us, we love them. And, there was in Cambridge, the Colonel Taylor Inn. I was walking up to the second floor, and there was this thing just going whiz, 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 like cats do. And I realized it was a cat. It was going through walls and everything. And I told the owner, and she says, that was our son's cat, our late son's cat. He just sort of hangs around here. So if I thoroughly believe that animals, stay where they're loved. And there's just too many stories about people saying, "Oh yeah, I saw my cat after it died," or "My dog reacted to the dog who had just died being there," feeling like the dog was still there. So yeah, I'm trying to remember what other encounters I've had with animal ghosts, but that one stuck in my mind, because it was just so cat-like. They're just always whizzing around.
There's a question about what a changeling is.
Oh, sorry. A changeling is a baby, usually, not always. It could be an adult woman, usually, stolen by the fairies, and they leave a substitute. And what happens is that the substitute is suddenly a cranky baby or a sickly baby, and you have to do something drastic to get your baby back from the fairies. And unfortunately, it led to a great deal of murder, of infanticide. It's a very gruesome subject. So that it's not at all pleasant.
And there's a question about your dream place to visit.
Oh gosh. Mm. I really like British ghost places. I really would like to do another ghost tour of England. We went to a place called Calk Abbey, and the owners were very misogynistic and just kind of uppity, as it were. And they insisted that the maids stand with their faces to the wall while the owner would be walking by. You could never look at him. And I kept sensing these poor maids, and I didn't know this until after I had spoken to the people, the staff. But these were like ladies standing against the wall. And there was also in the hall, there was a big rocking horse, and I saw a little boy wearing a blue dress because boys wore dresses in this era. And I had my daughter with me, and I said, "Do you notice anything in this hall?" And she said, "Yeah, there's a little boy in a blue dress standing there by the rocking horse, and I don't like his looks." So we went upstairs, and in the great hall there were all kinds of things. He was whoever this little boy was, when he grew up, he was a taxidermist. So the hall was full of stuffed animals. It's kind of gruesome if you feel that way about it. And she said, she tugged on me and she says, "There's the little boy." And there he was in a portrait wearing the same blue outfit. So I guess she didn't like him because he was killing animals.
Well, so I don't, if anybody has any other questions, and, but I don't see any other ones here, but,
Okay.
I think, I mean, this has been really, really interesting. And, where can people find, I know that they're on Amazon. I
Hmm.
could find, you know, at least 11 of your books on Amazon.
Yeah.
Uh, and, we have quite a few of them here at the Heritage Center in our gift shop, and most bookstores I know are carrying them, at least in Ohio. That
Right. So I would say, ask your local bookstore or library to order it, and come to the Historical Society and buy it from their gift shop.
so, yeah,
I
it's
got a
been,
couple questions.
oh, all right, go ahead, Patty.
When you said you don't bring things into your house, is that things that you bought at an auction, a garage sale, or
Yeah.
antique stores?
Yeah.
And how do you know there's something attached?
I just know, it's just that feeling. You touch something and you say, "Oh yeah, I don't want that in my house."
I have
So,
a friend that did that, bought a clock at a antique store and the hands were going backwards when she picked it up.
ooh,
She did take it home, so she's had a lot of problems at her house.
mm,
And the other question is, have you ever had a ghost join you in a car when you're driving?
only a relative. My grandfather, I used to do a lot of touring, and I'd be driving around in the dark in strange parts of Ohio that I didn't know that well. And my grandfather would come and sit in the seat beside me and just sort of keep me company. It was very nice.
My friend drove past where there had been a death in a car accident and the person
Oh,
got in the car with her.
oh my word.
I was with her and she told him to get out.
Yeah.
But
My.
your stories are fascinating and I want to make sure she sees your recording.
Thank you.
And Patty is one of our volunteers who works in
Ah,
collections, and she always brings me all sorts of cool artifacts for people to guess what they are.
oh,
But
wonderful.
I know with the stuff that we have and the building that we're in that's 127 years old, I try not to think about it too hard, especially I'm here by myself right now and I have to leave. But and I work on the third floor with the attic above me, and it always sounds like there's people walking around up there, and it's just
Yeah.
very windy place. But I try not to think about what may be, or tell myself I don't really believe that there's stuff attached to the artifacts and things that we have, because we have so much stuff that I try, we try and share the stories that we know about the stuff, but I
Right.
try not to think too hard about anyone that might still feel connections to those things, because it would make it more difficult for me to do my job and not be afraid of
Absolutely.
everything.
Oh,
But there's a question about the book on changelings, if you have an idea when that one's going to be coming out.
I'm told it's summer of 2025.
Okay.
It'll be a hardback. It's probably going to be expensive because it's an academic press. Um, So,
Chris,
yes.
have you
Go ahead.
ever heard of anything about the Piat castles?
Oh, yes. I was told not to write about them because by the owner. So I've been discreet about it, but no one will know if I mention something here, maybe. I took my daughter there. There was one place, and I don't have the details in front of me. It's been a long time since I went, but you know, the end where there's sort of a chalet look, it I'm not sure which castle it is. I can never keep them straight. I can see it in my mind, but it was built for the lady who had consumption, and she died before she could move in because it was supposed to be healthier air out in the country. But I took my daughter there and to see if she would notice the same thing I noticed. That one corridor that runs down into what were basically servants' quarters, it was just full of misery. It was just like this one woman was just so unhappy there. And she walked up to it and she says, I can't go down there. It's just too painful. And she described the same thing that I had been feeling. And I talked to some volunteers who said they hear something walking around on the floor above them when they're there alone. So I think there's a lot going on there, but they didn't want to emphasize the ghostly aspects of it.
Now, do you think that spirits seek you out, knowing? I mean, you think that people that are sensitive, that they get sought out by people?
I think there are people that do that. I don't. It's not my job to send them on or to do a lot of communication with them. It's just sort of my job to point out what's there, what I feel. So I don't think they actually seek me out, except when I'm at a place. I was at a shop in Bell Fountain where a man had accidentally, or maybe not, drunk something that killed him. And he popped up while I was walking around the shop and he kept saying, I'm sorry, tell my wife I'm sorry. And I think he was trying to apologize for committing suicide because I believe he did. And I'm like, tell your wife yourself, you can do that. But he just, sometimes they can't hear. They're so focused on what's gone wrong. And it's really unfortunate, but I don't feel like it's my job to try to send people on as they do in some of the shows, look to the light and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And well, I was to say, I know you've been here to do research, and I know people have asked to investigate this building and stuff, and we have turned down most requests, mostly because we have to work here. And it would make things a little scarier for, I know, me to go in the basement and things like that. If I knew,
yes.
It's not just in my mind that someone has encountered something. So
Right.
we've kind of stayed away from letting anyone come here that we know would tell us anything.
Okay. Well, I won't come and walk around.
I say, if you come and just don't tell me. Just don't tell me.
Okay.
You can probably maybe tell other people. But yeah, so yeah, this is all really very interesting. And do you do your podcast on a regular basis that you have listed on here?
Once a month, on the first of every month, we do a podcast. I'm collaborating with a British academic who lives in Italy named Simon Young, and he's also the editor of the Changeling book. So we have a good time nattering about ghosts and fairies and what have you. Let's see, I'm trying to think what our next. We just did an episode on celebrity ghosts with some Michael Jackson sightings. That was exciting.
Oh, wow. Really interesting. Yeah, definitely we'll have to check that one out. So you got one coming up next week on
Yep.
first. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Well, if there's no other questions, if anyone else wants to unmute and ask, do that now. But I want to thank you again and let you guys know our next virtual program is still sort of along the same vein, where it will be a cemetery talk with Stuart Brock, who Patty helped connect me with, who's been working on restoring some local cemetery stones and things like that. So he's going to talk about the do's and don'ts of trying to care for stones of loved ones, or, you know, if you want to get involved in a larger project or things like that. So he'll be sharing that. That will be on November 20th, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, at 7 o'clock. And then we have our in-person program coming up on November 14th is about the book The Other Trail of Tears by Mary Stockwell. So she's talking about the Ohio and Indian removal. So that will be an in-person program here at the Heritage Center. So Chris, thank you once again. This has been
Thank
wonderful.
you.
And
Well,
this will be, we'll be able to share this, and I think people will really enjoy this. And it's been great hearing from you.
thank you, and happy hauntings.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Have a great night.